Hello and welcome to part 3 of our Dune Tank and Briefs Sewalong. In today's episode, we're going to get to sewing. We are going to test out all of our stretch stitches. We're going to get busy with this bad boy here, our conventional machine, and this guy over here, our handy dandy serger. So we're going to go through all of your choices. It should be noted, if you didn't already know, that the pattern, both pieces can be sewn entirely with this guy, your regular sewing machine. I'm going to talk through different stretch stitches that you may or may not have, and then go from essentially what's the ideal choice down to what is passable. And just, it should be known that everyone has something that's passable, and that's totally fine. You don't need to have ideal. But depending on what you have, I'm going to go through both of those and show you all of your choices. I'm going to test out some of the different threads, the regular and the stretch, and get cutting and just get everything ready so that on the next episode, because we're going to start sewing in that one. So in this one, we're going to get everything prepped and test everything out. So if you're ready, here we go. The first thing we're going to do is cut out our pattern. Now, if you needed to do any of the alterations that I demoed in the previous installment of our sew along, you will have already cut your pattern piece out, obviously. But if you are just using the pattern straight as is and you haven't done any of that, then obviously before we cut out our fabric, we need to cut our pattern piece out. So I'm going to go ahead and cut mine out. I'm going to be making a size large in both the tank and in the briefs. So I'm going to cut those pieces out now. Once you have all of your pattern pieces cut out, it's time to cut out our fabric. Now, if you're following the layout in the pattern instructions, if you're using a 45-inch wide fabric, you'll see that you need to have the fold on one side and then the selvage on the other side. It'll be folded in sort of a traditional way in that way, because it's not very wide and you can't fit more than what's in the diagram on the width. But the wider fabric, if you're using more of a 58 or 60 inch wide fabric, we can get more in the width. And so if you've never used that kind of layout before, it might look a little foreign to you in the instructions. So all that's happening is we have our center fold here, and then all this fabric, and then our selvage is over here. And what we want to do is open this up so that each side of the selvage is coming in towards that center fold. So I'm going to do exactly that. I'm going to open this up, and I'm going to fold into the center fold. So I've got now half of the width from this selvage right here. This is my center fold. And what I'm essentially doing is creating 2 folds per width. So normally if you fold it once, you have just 1 fold on that amount of width. But because I'm folding into center, I'm gonna have a fold on that side and I'm gonna have a fold on this side. And that's helpful when you've got pattern pieces that are placed on the fold. So I can now lay everything out, starting with the pieces that are on the fold. So if you're doing both the tank and the briefs, you might be able to do a little bit better than what the layout shows in the diagram. So what I typically do is place everything out and see if I can, do better than what's listed in the diagram, because you might be able to. I mean, when we lay those out as pattern designers, again, we can't configure every possible scenario, so you might be able to do better than what it says in there. So I'm gonna just take a minute here and lay everything out before I get cutting. Once you've cut all your pieces out, you've got everybody here, you want to go around to each piece and walk yourself around all the sides to find your notches. Now, I mentioned this in a previous video, but keep in mind that the notches for the Dune should be cut really small, because the seam allowance is either a quarter for where the bindings attach to the garment, or they are 3/8 around all of the seams. So we want to just make sure we can see the notches, but we want to cut them very conservatively. So I can see there's a notch here, so I'm going to just make a little snip right where that line is for the size that I'm making. And I'm gonna just continue to do that around, find all of my notches. Now, if you find a notch that's on the fold, so this is the tank back, there's a little diagonal right here where the top of the center fold is, which is the center back. You wanna just make a snip right into the fold itself to just mark where center is. You don't have to mark that whole triangle wedge out. You just want to make a little snip there so that you know where center is. And on the tank back, that's the only notch that we have all the way around. And again, I'm going to continue to do that and just walk myself around all of the pattern pieces, finding my notches, snipping them, and making sure I don't miss any. Before we start sewing, we are going to change out our needle and we are going to do a bunch of testing with our fabric. This is true if you've sewn with knits for years or if you're brand new to knits. Every knit fabric is going to be a little different. If you're working with the same kind of knit over and over and over, then you probably know how it's going to handle. But if you're working with something you've never used before, then you definitely want to do a test and just check out how your stitches are going to handle it. And so I'm going to walk you through what some of the better choices are for a conventional machine with both polyester thread and with our stretch nylon thread, so we can just see how it all handles differently. Also, just a note, when you are cutting your scraps, I like to cut two different kinds of pieces. This one you can see, hopefully you can see that the grain is going this direction. So this is, my selvage was here and my selvage was here. So this is the cross grain. So I have two chunks here so that I can sew perpendicular to my cross grain, because this is the direction I'll be sewing when I'm sewing my side seams, and I want to see how the stretch handles as it's going down the fabric. And then I have another scrap where it's cut with the cross grain going the same direction, but the piece is long this way, so that I can sew with the cross grain, which is how it will be when I'm hemming, and as I'm engaging the bindings are all going to be going more or less that direction. So I like to test both to just see how it's handling going with the cross grain and going down the cross grain, so that I can see how it's going to go as I'm, working on my actual fabric. So we want to change out to our needle. We didn't talk about needles in the tools section, but just a word about needles. There's stretch and there's jersey. If you already have one or the other in your stash, it's fine. You can use either one. But ideally, jersey is a ballpoint needle that you would use with slightly more natural fiber. So this is a cotton, 95 cotton, 5% spandex. So a jersey would be a better choice for this. And a stretch would be more ideal for more synthetic fabrics, like if you're sewing a bathing suit or a bra or something, for example. But like I said, if you're sewing this and you have stretch and you don't have jersey, it's fine. You can definitely use a stretch. But if you're going out to buy the right needle, you probably want a jersey needle for this, because it's going to have a slightly more rounded point. And the whole idea of a ballpoint is that the point of the needle will go through the fibers versus puncturing the fibers. If you knit, or if you have a sweater and you ever got a hole in it, the whole thing starts to unravel, and that's what's going to happen with your knit fabrics. If you start breaking threads, you'll start getting holes in it. And the jersey needle has a ballpoint so that it will glide between the fibers and not puncture and break the fibers. So I'm going to use this needle here, this jersey. I'm going to be using a size 70. Again, you want to treat that the same way you would with a woven fabric. 70 to 75, 80 for like a lightweight to medium weight. 80 to 90 for like medium to heavier weights. Anything like in that general ballpark is good. So we've changed out to my jersey needle, and I'm going to thread the machine and we're going to give this some testing. So first I'm going to go through everything with the polyester thread. And then we'll check all of those stitches and we'll see how that looks. And then we'll change out to the stretch nylon thread and see how that looks. If you've never really read your manual and you're unsure if you have stretch stitches for your machine, this is where you're going to find out. I've got my manual here for my Bernina. It's very helpful. And even though I've been sewing for a really long time, this machine has things on it I've never used before. So I couldn't possibly know what they're for and what the ideal settings are without my manual. That's why we have it here. So the stitches we want to make sure we have, for sure, everyone's going to need to have at least a zigzag. This is the minimum stitch requirement for sewing with a stretch fabric because the stitch needs to stretch along with the fabric. So you really can't just use a regular straight stitch for sewing on knits and expect it to hold up. It's going to pop at a certain point. So a zigzag is great for sewing your seams if you have no other alternative. But it's also a great choice for top stitching all of your binding on. It's my preferred stitch for that. So you're going to want it for at least that. Then selecting, on my machine, it's selecting the red stitches, which are the stretch stitches. So on my machine, there's a second set of stitches that you can get to. And this is really common. You might have yours might be marked with SS for stretch stitches. So there might be a dial where you are using half of it for regular stitches, and then there's a second half of it that's for stretch stitches, and you would be turning to those SS stitches to engage all of the same stitches but with a stretch. So that might be what yours looks like. The best choice is something called a double overlock. This would be your ideal choice for sewing seams. So if you have something that looks like that, that's called a double overlock or something similar, and you're going to see in the handout, the instruction guide, it'll have an image of what that stitch looks like. There's also a triple straight stitch, which isn't actually 3 rows of stitches. That is misleading. What that means is that it's going forward, back, forward, back, forward, back the entire time it's sewing, which allows the stitch to stretch. And those are my favorite choices for a regular machine. So we're going to try some of those out. So we have this page right here in the instructions that's going to go through what some of the choices are. So first, let's just try our wide zigzag, which is a width of 3 and a length of 2.5. And as it says here, this is the best option for top stitching the bindings and straps. So we're just going to see how that handles. So 2.5 and 3. And a couple things you're going to notice right away when you're testing things out. You can see that the upper level is sort of being pushed forward. This is not uncommon. If you experience that, you can adjust the pressure of the presser foot. It's hard to say, the pressure of the presser foot. What I like to do is occasionally sink my needle and pick up my foot and let the fabric sort of spring back so that you're not stretching it as you're going. So there's our first stitch. This is our width of 3 and our length of 2.5, and it stretches quite well. I can feel that there's a limit to it. Like if I keep pulling, it's probably going to snap, but that stretches quite well and feels good in the opposite direction. Now this would be our ideal choice for our top stitching and not for our side seams. So let's change to the narrow zigzag and see how that looks and feels. So that would be the minimum requirement for your seams, would be the narrow zigzag. So we're going to do a width of 1 and a length of 3. So you can see it's still providing a bit of a zigzag. It's still stretching. It definitely feels tighter than this one. This one's stretching a lot. This one has a limit for sure. But it's still going to give me a pretty good smooth side seam. If you open it up, you can start to see the stitch color there because it's not a completely flat seam. So as you're wearing your garment, if it's pulling tight, you're going to start to see the inside here. So that's why we made it as narrow as we possibly could get away with. Still providing some stretch, but there's a chance you're going to snap that if you were to really pull on it. Let's try the double overlock, which is that other stitch here. And that is in my stretch stitch choices. And I'm going to change that to a width of 3 and a length of 2.5, just like my wide zigzag. And you can see how that guy looks. And I don't know if you can tell, but the fabric is coming forward and back as it's moving. And what that's giving us is a straight edge on one side and an ample amount of stretch. It's a nice strong stitch. It's the closest thing you're going to get to sort of a serger style stitch. And it gives you a nice, super smooth side seam. So if you have that choice, that is a really good, strong choice for a conventional machine. And again, that's the double overlock. Lastly, let's try the stretch straight stitch, which is again also sometimes called a triple straight stitch. I'm going to put this on just a regular straight stitch setting, so about 2.5 in length and a 0 width. And again, you're going to see it's going to go forward, back, forward, back, forward, back. Now what that does, you can see it's like really thick outline. And again, it provides stretch, but also gives you a nice straight side seam. It's not going to have as much stretch as these other choices, but it does stretch. For other projects, just note to self, this is basically a reinforced straight stitch. So it's also really great on crotch seams to reinforce your crotch seams. So that's how they handle if I'm going to be sewing on my side seam. So let's check out what it's going to do if I'm sewing in the opposite direction. So we're going to try all of those one more time. So going back to our wide zigzag, we're going to have a width of 3 and a length of 2.5. And again, we're going to see how that handles. This is a good stitch to practice in this direction with your greatest amount of stretch, because if you're doing a zigzag on the hem, that's going to be on your hem, and you can see again that handles it really, really well. Like I'm really pulling on that and it's not snapping. Excellent choice for hemming. We're going to now try the narrow zigzag, which we most likely would not be using in this direction, but it's also just good to check it out. And again, it definitely stretches, but significantly less than the wide zigzag for sure. Now let's try our 2 stretch stitches. So we're going to try that double overlock again. Again, really nice amount of stretch. It's definitely denser than the zigzag. The zigzag has the greatest amount of stretch, actually. And now let's try our triple zigzag, or our triple straight stitch. And again, very dense, but it has a decent amount of stretch. So not too dissimilar from the other direction. The zigzag has the best stretch. The double overlock has really good stretch and is nice and dense and strong feeling. The narrow zigzag has some stretch, but not nearly as much, but enough so that you could sew a knit project with it. And the straight stretch stitch is also quite dense and strong in its feel with some stretch. So now that we checked all of these stitches with our regular polyester thread, I want to go through and try them with this stretch nylon thread. I have one of these thread stands that you can put your thread on and have it sit behind your machine. And you wind your bobbin just like normal. Threading the machine is definitely tricky because this thread is very fuzzy. So I have the machine loaded up now with the stretch nylon thread. We're going to test out all of these same stitches that we just did just to see how they handle differently. So let's just go through them the same way we did before. So first we're going to start with our zigzag, our wide zigzag with a width of 3 and a length of 2.5. And we're going to go down the fabric. So this would be the equivalent of the side seam. And we're just going to see how this goes. A little bit of a loop in the thread there. So here's our regular zigzag, and here's the nylon zigzag, and I would say it definitely stretches more. There's still a limit to it, it's not just infinite, but it's definitely, this one I can feel like if I keep pulling it's gonna snap. This one feels like it has a much greater span of forgiveness. So that's interesting. So now let's try the narrow zigzag. And I think this is a really important one to test because if you only have zigzag as your side seam choice and you are forced to use this narrow zigzag, you might gain a lot more strength and stretch by using this kind of thread. So again, our regular zigzag and then our nylon. To be honest, it doesn't feel much different. I feel a limit there, I feel a limit there. It doesn't feel that much different, to be totally honest. A little. There's a little bit more, but not a lot actually. Let's try the double overlock. Again, here's the regular thread, and here's the nylon thread. Definitely has more give than the regular, but not a ton more. So now let's try our stretch straight stitch. That one definitely has good stretch. It's similar. I think what is the difference for me personally is the polyester thread feels like if I keep pulling on it, I'm probably gonna break it. Where the nylon thread feels like if I keep pulling on it, it's gonna just keep giving before it's gonna snap. This thread doesn't break. Like I can't break it with my hand, where the polyester thread I can. So I think that's ultimately what the main difference is that the stretch ability is not that much different, but the nylon thread won't break as easily. So even if they only give the same amount of stretch, the nylon thread's not going to snap as quickly as the polyester thread. That's my very unscientific analysis to the situation. Yeah. So let's check out what it all looks like on a serger. Now, if you have a serger or an overlock machine, this is obviously a really great machine choice for sewing with knits. If you've never really explored it with knits before, then again, I would get out your manual and check to see what your settings should be set to, because every serger is going to be a little bit different. Mine is it's a Husqvarna Viking Husky Lock 936. I've had it for a few decades now and I love it. And mine is the kind where you set it up so it has pre-programmed things in it, so I can just set it to a medium weight knit, and it tells me how to set everything, and then it does everything it's supposed to do internally. So it's a pretty easy machine to work with in that way. So we're gonna just do a stitch, same as we've been doing, a stitch in the direction with the stretch, the cross grain, and then a stitch down with the way we would be if we were going on the side seam with the length of grain. Now this is something I do every single time I sew a new knit, because I just want to double check that it's gonna handle it correctly and I don't have to adjust everything. So it just is a good confirmation that it's gonna flow right, because it has a knife in it. There's no joke with a serger. Like, once you go through, if it's not looking great, you have sewn it, you've got 4 threads in there, and the knife cut everything else off. So I like to just always double check this. And it's true actually for even non-knits. Before I use my serger, I just run a scrap through to just make sure everything is set the way I want it to be set. Now what you're looking for with a serger is exactly the way this looks here. It's not curled, it's not curling up, it's not curling down, it's not rippled, it's sitting nice and flat, and the seam is just nice and smooth. And this is going to give me tremendous stretch, and it's going to give me a lot of security, because it has a security stitch, a safety stitch, as well as a regular straight stitch, and then the 2 loopers, and then it cuts off your seam allowance. If you've never thought about having a serger, if you're really getting into knits, it's pretty much the jam. I mean, they're pretty amazing to work with knits. You can bust out t-shirts and turtlenecks and things and leggings really quick and easy and strong. This is a nice strong stitch. So that handled that well. It's not curling, it's not looking weird. And we're going to do the same thing going down the fabric here. And yep, that's exactly how you want it to look. Again, nice and smooth, everything looks good. Confirming that it's going to handle it just the way I want it to. So now we are good to go and to get started on actually sewing the tank itself. All right, I hope you learned something. what are your choices, what's best for you. The best thing to do at this point is to experiment. I've taught a lot of knit classes, maybe you were in one of them, and if you were, you know that I always insist that you guys whip out your manual, look at all of your choices, and play around. It's the best way to find out what is good for you and your machine choices. So I hope today was educational in that way and made you realize that you can just play around and see what's best, and that there's a lot of really good choices out there for stitches specifically. Then we're gonna get everything cut. You're gonna make your pattern alterations if you needed to do that before obviously cutting everything out. And then in the next part, we're gonna start sewing. So that's when it starts to get really fun. All this preliminary stuff, it's just busy work, it feels like sometimes, but it's all really critical. So next episode, we're going to actually get to sewing our tank top, and I'm excited about that. I hope you are too.